Give me a thumbs up when we're ready to go.
Yeah. Oh, just one sec. My dogs are making. Okay, Dallas, we're live right now. So yeah, you can say bonjour, introduce yourself, all that good stuff.
Right on. Thanks, Gretchen. Bonjour, honey, kinawea. Indinaway maganadug, mishkunang dishnakas. Amjanang dontba. Wabjeshi dodem. Anishinaabe meanwa bodowadmi nindao. It's just a little brief introduction about myself in our language, Anishinaabe Moen, better known as Ojibwe. Tonight we're really excited to bring on Niigaan Wendenham, James Sinclair. He's an Anishinaabe he's an academic and writer based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. He's originally from Selkirk, Manitoba. So he's involved in a lot of different things. He's an award-winning writer and an editor. He's been on Canada's top 20 most influential people. He's a Canadian columnist. He's done many great things. So I'm not going to take too much time away from Niigaan because I know he's got a lot of great things. Tonight we're talking about envisioning Indigenous achievement. So welcome, Niigaan. I'll let you take over from here and enjoy, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you here. Miigwech.
Okay, so bonjour everyone. Bonjour ndinwe magraduk. Niigaan webedam Indigenous nakas namgo shindo dem. Imen wanda mo mayayan. Bonjour nimishom sak na komasak. Nimiji nibekwe mijana gijik. It's a pleasure to be here. Bungi Pegwis and Donchi, Anishinaabe and Dao. It's a pleasure to share with you the language of the territory in which I come from. I come from Treaty 1. This is where I'm sitting right now. So it's very nice to see everyone. And my name's Niigaan. And yeah, I always feel like, I should get to know everyone a little bit at the beginning, but it's very difficult in this pandemic that we're in. And I don't get a chance to greet everybody and say hello to everybody, but I certainly know that there are a lot of really great people in your area. And I'm very lucky in that I get to, spend a little bit of time in your space. My only sadness is I don't get to spend time in your territory. But of course, I see the wonderful slate of speakers that you have, including people that I do ceremonies with, including Jason and Bindige and all just amazing people. I see names like Akawenzi and other people that are within your territory. And of course, the great people that you work with, like Dallas. You're very lucky that you work with people like Dallas and Gretchen in these areas, and Jawan, and just the really great people that you've got setting up this week. I'm very excited to be starting out your first presenter. And I know that we're talking about Indigenous education, but, I am a former high school teacher, and I am a person who works a lot with education now as a recovering teacher. I'm in the fourth step of the process, which I think is acceptance. I'm on my way past rage and depression, and but I was a grade 9 teacher for a long period of time, and I taught at a school called Kelvin High School, and I can remember my very first day of teaching at Kelvin High School. I grew up as a young Anishinaabe guy here in Manitoba. My whole life has been here. My family's Cree from Norway House. My Anishinaabe from originally Bawating, but migrated into Manitoba in the 17th century and settled at a place called St. Peter's Indian Settlement, Peguis First Nation. That's where I grew up. And, we were forced off the land in 1907, forced to move to where Peguis is now in the Interlake. But my family stayed, and Selkirk sort of grew up around us. And so that's where I grew up, is on our traditional homelands, but very much a town. And I never really knew, anything other than being Anishinaabe, being at the Friendship Center my whole life, being at ceremonies since I've been very young. And so my very first day as a teacher, I finished teaching, did my diploma, my degree. And then, there I was a drama teacher, and I taught at a school that's hired at a school named Kelvin High School. Now, if you don't know who Kelvin High School is, it's arguably the most important public school here in Manitoba. Neil Young went there, for example, so it's a very big deal if you know who Neil Young is. Kelvin's a really big deal in terms of the city, and it really lives in one of the most affluent areas of the city called River Heights. And so quite a very well-off school. For example, right beside the school is St. Mary's Girls Academy, which is arguably one of the biggest private schools in Winnipeg. And then right beside that, which should tell you really about what Calvin's all about, is the Sherry Zedek Synagogue. So the most richest area of the city, very Jewish area, where the original suburbs was right here, Winnipeg, right across the river as Winnipeg developed in the downtown core, where all the Indigenous peoples are, all the immigrant populations are, where the train lines are. As the more affluent people then grew up, and then St. James and River Heights and so on, and eventually Charleswood. But this area that I got hired in, I was the first Indigenous teacher in the south end of Winnipeg, which is crazy when you think about Winnipeg, the most Indigenous city in the country. But yet I was the first. And so many of us are still a generation of firsts. And as we're thinking about, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute. But, on my very first day, I walked into Calvin. And my principal called me out of the office and he said, welcome, Mr. Sinclair. Nice to see you. Are you ready for this year? And I said, I'm ready, Mr. Wilkes. He says, well, this year is the big musical. And I said, okay. All right. He says, we're going to put 150 kids on stage, which is the really big year. And, every second year we put the small, 10, 15 people on stage. This year's 150 kids on stage. Are you ready? I said, I'm ready, Mr. Wilkes. And I've been trained for that moment. I was very excited. I really wanted a drama job. I wanted to do a really good, wanted to make a very good impression. And he says, okay, well, this is the musical we're doing this year. Now, the way musicals work, if you're a drama teacher, is it's often booked well in advance. And so he slid the script across the table at me. And on the front of it, it said, Fiddler on the Roof. And I was like, oh, Fiddler on the Roof. I said, I don't know anything about Fiddler on the Roof. I said, I know like a little bit. I know it's like a musical about Jewish people. That's about all I knew. And I never seen it. And so I was like, okay, so like, what do I do now? And I thought back to myself and I said, geez, I never even knew if I knew Jewish people growing up. Turns out I did, by the way. There were people who I went to high school with who were Jewish, but nobody ever talked about it. And there's really never went to their house or anything. And then, here's what I did. I would do what most people would do. I ran to the synagogue across the street and ran to the rabbi and said, okay, Rabbi, I got 1 hour. Tell me everything about being Jewish. Go. And of course, he didn't tell me anything about being Jewish. We got to know each other's family, the names a little bit, shared some tea. But there I was. Now I had to pick my entire cast the next week because the way Calvin does musicals, we do it in December. And so I was like, what the heck am I going to do here? How am I going to be able to do the most Jewish musical of all time for the Jewish community? Because if you know what Fiddler on the Roof is about, it's about anti-Semitism. It's about Jewish expulsion, about Jewish culture. There's a wedding in it. You got to know Jewish language. You got to know about Jewish ceremonies. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes in there and you have to know it all. And so what did I do? Well, I watched the movie. I went and found a Blockbuster, if you remember what that is. And I rented the movie and then I came home. I watched it like 10 times. And then I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to act exactly like the Jewish people do in the movies. And so I picked my cast. We started rehearsals, started saying, okay, everybody do this. And they were like, that's not the way Jewish people act. And I said, well, pronounce the words this way. And they're like, that's not the way the words are pronounced. And I said, well, let's do the wedding. And we mapped it all out. They're like, that's not the way weddings go. Well, I don't know if you all know this, but Jewish people are like a living, breathing culture. They're like people who change and grow, and like all human beings or cultures in the world, innovate and create and adapt and adopt. So I said, I don't know what to do here. And pretty soon the kid said, well, okay, fine. Listen, my mom teaches Hebrew classes on the weekend. She'll come in and teach us the language. And then another kid said, well, this is what we'll do. I'll bring in a bunch of stuff from my garage and we'll decorate the scenes and so on. And I was at a wedding last weekend. And so why don't I bring in some people who did the wedding? We'll show everybody how it goes. And pretty soon I had the kids blocking the scenes. I had kids decorating the scenes. I had parents coming in teaching the language. And then in 3 months, I put on the most Jewish musical of all time for the Jewish community. And I wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most beautiful show of all time. But here's what happened on the second night. On the second night, who do you think showed up? The rabbi. And the rabbi walked up to me at the end and looked at me and said, not bad. And then he just walked out of the gym. That was it. And that's my total reviews. That's every single thing I know about how I did teaching the most Jewish musical of all time to the Jewish community. But here's what else I know. I'm still friends with all those kids. I still run into those parents all the time because Winnipeg is a super small place. I run into them even during the pandemic. In fact, I was at the mall last week and I ran into 2 parents, the kids that I had taught during Fiddler on the Roof. And when I was on the plane 2 weeks before the pandemic started, who was sitting on the plane but the kid I chose to be the fiddler on the roof. And there he was sitting in first class. And my first question to him, like, what are you doing in first class? Why am I not sitting here? But anyways, okay. So I'm trying to tell you that I, in 3 months, was able to stage the most Jewish musical of all time, teaching Jewish culture, teaching Jewish history, teaching Jewish kids their own positions, who they are. And I didn't offend anybody. I didn't certainly become a big expert. I wasn't a PhD level on Jewish culture. In fact, I probably know just a little bit more now than I knew when I started. But I put people in the right positions. I empowered them. I brought the knowledge in necessary from the community. And if I can do that with Jewish culture, history, tradition, you can do that with Indigenous knowledge. You can do that with Indigenous history. You can do that with Indigenous communities. That's how easy it is. The key is are you ready to take this brave step necessary to reach outside of yourself, to bring in the elements of the Indigenous community that will then empower and build and make employable citizens? Because the fact is that if you're not able to teach young Indigenous peoples about who they are, and as importantly, non-Indigenous peoples, how Indigenous peoples have created their identity, built everything that they know is Canadian. Every single thing that is Canadian is Indigenous in its core. The economy, every single policy of this country, every single inch of this country is Indigenous in its core. If we do not teach Canadians appropriately of who they fundamentally are, we're ultimately not doing our jobs. And frankly, those students are unemployable. They don't deserve jobs, and frankly, neither do you. If you're not able to teach young people who they fundamentally are, which is that they are created by Indigenous peoples, or if they're Indigenous peoples, who they fundamentally are at the same time. That's the job of schools. That's the job of what I hope these next 2 weeks that you spend talking about Indigenous education is all about. What I want to do is I want to really challenge us today to think a little bit about what we think of in terms of achievement. And I want to show a little bit of stuff of what we're doing, and as I pull up my slideshow here, in terms of understanding a little bit about who we are, why we're here, who can help us, and where are we going. Like, what are those things that are, I think, really important? You know, as an Indigenous professional, you do a lot of different things, but probably the most important thing of all is that you are always a kin. You're always a family member. Like, I don't give that up just because I have letters behind my name or awards or whatever. I'm still a father. I'm still a brother. I'm still a nephew. And, you know, here's evidence of what that looks like. So I went out and got you see these degrees behind me? I thought they were, I thought it was pretty big stuff. This was my graduating class. You can see the bottom left-hand corner here. I thought I was a pretty big deal. I went out to the world and I've done things like speak to the World Court, which is right up here, and speak about the United Nations and speak with lawyers and judges all across the world. I've also done advocacy work right here in Winnipeg, working with street level people in poverty. You can check out my Facebook page if you ever want to see the work that I do with Mama Bear Clan, which is working with tent cities and advocating for people who are in dire poverty. 99% of them are Indigenous people, my relatives, people who I know and people whose family I know, people who I'm related to. And so I do all of that, but none of that really matters. And here's a good example of what it means is, like, I can go and get a PhD. Came back to my auntie's house and I said, "Hey, Auntie, look at this. I'm Dr. Sinclair. They all got to call me Dr. Sinclair now." And she went to the closet. She smiled. She went to the closet and she said, "Here, Dr. Sinclair, here's an axe. Now go chop me some wood." Now, what does that mean? My auntie doesn't dislike university or somehow scared of it or something. She certainly doesn't not love me, or she's proud of me in every single way. My auntie loves me beyond belief. But she's there to remind me that no matter what happens, I still have responsibilities in this life. And that is to be Anishinaabe, to be a good father and brother and Ogichita and a firekeeper and a person who is always completely a nephew. And that it's my job to never forget that. There has never once, not ever, been an Indigenous community that have taught their young people to leave. They've encouraged them to do perhaps a task or something to go out part-time, but there has not once, not ever, been an Indigenous community that's asked their young people to leave. Now, this right here is Kakwakanami. And I want you to think about what I just said there. The two things that I've just said. The one is the Fiddler on the Roof story. The second is that we've never once, not ever, taught our young people to leave, to go, to never come back. What we've done is we've always said, we want you to contribute. You are still a nephew. You are always a son. Now, this is Kakwakanami. Now, Kakwakanami is someone who I've written part of my book about. I've also done a degree studying his work as an Anishinaabe person in the probably arguably one of the most hardest time in Anishinaabe life, which is the beginning of the 18th century. The beginning of the 18th century was the most hardest time, particularly those in your territory, the territories in and around Southern Ontario, post War of 1812, because the life of Anishinaabe was under incredible duress and incredible genocide was taking place right before our very eyes. And in some cases that was overt. People were, killing people, but for the most part, it was a kind of subversive genocide, in that it was involved the occupation of territories. And the occupation are what we would call the flooding of Anishinaabe territories in Southern Ontario after 1812. Now, Kakwakanami was born in 1802. And when he was born in 1802, this was the world in which this flooding was right in the midst of happening. It really started in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, where that U.S.-Canadian border is invented for the first time. But that's not really enforced until the War of 1812, which of course is the great battle between the British and their Indigenous allies, predominantly Tecumseh, and then of course all the other affiliations from the Three Fires Confederacy that then went down and burnt down the White House. And there were certain times during the Donald Trump years where I was like, not a bad idea. But anyways, okay. So, during Anishinaabe territories after War of 1812, all the refugees from that war then come in and flood out Anishinaabe territory, mostly Mississauga. But of course, going all the way down to Walpole Island, which is down near Detroit and Windsor. And then, of course, going as far north as all the way to the St. Lawrence, like Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee territory. And these are territories that we had for long times had relationships with Wendat, for example, the Wendat Confederacy. And of course, our affiliations with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations. And so these are territories in which we had multiple treaties, multiple lands, multiple claims and operations for millennia, for a very long period of time. And suddenly when you plop Toronto or Hamilton or Guelph or, thousands of settlers into those areas, the caribou becomes disrupted, the food lines, the fish, all of these things become polluted. And then probably most of all is that then starvation sets in. Starvation is what leads to smallpox. And probably the biggest lie I've ever been told in my life is that we somehow, as Indigenous peoples, were somehow susceptible to European disease, which is the biggest lie I've ever heard in my life. We weren't susceptible to European disease, but we were susceptible to starvation because our lives are so intricately tied with the land. So when you flood the territories around us, then we starve. And the sickness then begins to happen out of that. And that starvation that happens, which results in 90% population loss, is something Kakwakanami witnessed, Peter Jones witnessed. He decides to convert in 1823 to become Methodist. And he does that not because he's rejecting Anishinaabe, but because he sees the possibility of what Christianity has to offer Anishinaabe, which is for the most part food, which is for the most part resources, and yes, eventually employment in an ever-changing world. And he spent the rest of his life advocating for that. In fact, in many ways, questioning the very nature of Anishinaabe tradition in an increasingly industrialized world, which is, I think, a legitimate question. It's a question that we ask in ceremony. It's a question that we sing and we dance about. It's a question that we engage in regular basis. But the answer that is always found is we need to commit more to the land, commit more to our language, commit more to our ceremonies. But Kakwakanami was at that kind of question mark moment was, what do we do here? And so Kakwakanami, what he did was he was a big advocate for schooling. And he believed that schooling would be the method in which Anishinaabe can then have opportunity agency for themselves. And so what he did was he went all the way to England to advocate for schooling. And he would go and record images of what schooling is happening and then trying to make an argument for more schooling to be funded by the British authorities to support Indigenous peoples. this is what he writes about. And I want to read you this very short record that he wrote as a missionary, as a Christian, as an Anishinaabe in the 1830s. And this is what he wrote. He wrote an experience that he saw one day. He wrote, "It makes the heart of the poor Indian rejoice to see his child reading a book, to see him put the talk to paper, and to see the talk go to a distance. That makes him rejoice. I will give you one instance. At the River Credit, we have a station. A chief had a son who was instructed in our mission school. After he was employed as a teacher in another school and went away more than 100 miles from his father. After a time, he wrote a letter to his father in the Indian tongue, which he did not know how to read. The father brought it to me to read for him, and while I read, the tears ran down his eyes, and he rejoiced to hear the talk of his son on the paper at a distance." Now you're thinking to yourself, this is a very nice story. It's a story about a son writing a letter to a father who can't read, and Peter Jones then reads it to him. Now, what is the language of that letter? It's Anishinaabe. It is not English. It is fully and absolutely Anishinaabe. It is our language. But yet, this is what the role of school is for Kakwakanami. It gives Indigenous peoples the possibility of deeper connection via their experiences in the school. This is crucial. This is a crucial thing to understand, which is that schools must build relationship between Indigenous peoples for it to have legitimacy, for it to have relevance. If schools do something to disrupt or to undermine or question Indigenous relationships, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help Indigenous peoples. Frankly, it doesn't help non-Indigenous peoples, because what it does is it simply then creates dysfunctional, violent, genocidal relationships. And for the most part, that has been what schooling has been for 250 plus years. It has been about trying to take the Indian out of the child, and still is in so many ways. Like, for example, we still expect students to continue to be encouraged to move away from your community, go live in the city, far away from your community, go have a picket fence and a big house and make as much money as possible. Never go back to people who will even use the language. You've grown up, or you've grown better, or you're successful because you're successful living in Toronto, but you're not successful if you're living in Pakatawagan or Peguis First Nation. You don't return back to your community. This is the ways in which we subversively continue this genocide, which Peter Jones was witnessing all the way back in the 18th century. I tell you that because in this moment, Peter Jones sees the future, and he sees what education can do. He sees what education can do to save Anishinaabe during the most direst time possible. And that's our job. Our job is to see what is happening in reality. This is a wonderful project that I'm not involved, that is the Ogama Makana project, which is basically remapping Toronto. And it's saying, here are the ways in which we can see Toronto underneath the concrete, Indigenous presence. There's a wonderful way you can go and look at nativeland.ca. I encourage you to go check it out. It's a wonderful website. Nativeland.ca is a great website that then can show you territories, languages, and treaties. And as you begin to play around with that, you click on languages, you'll notice a number of things. Like, all the languages kind of overlap, and treaties overlap, territories overlap. And you're like, how does that work? Like, how did Indigenous nations have integrity if everybody was just all overlapping with one another? Like that doesn't seem to work. Like, question yourself this for a moment. What if Canada and the United States decided to move their border every year? What if they had a big meeting and it was Donald Trump or Joe Biden or whatever, and then, I was about to say Pierre Trudeau, but Justin Trudeau, what if they got together and they said, okay, let's figure out who needs what and where we're going to put the border this year. And where do you think Canada's border would be? Like, where do you think Canadians would all be living? I'm going to say Baffin Island. I'm going to say, like, way the heck up north. Inuit would be like, are you guys going home yet? Or what's the deal? Like, I'm trying to say that nation states have no investment in each other. Once America gets one thing, Canada gets one thing, they never return it back. It's all about competition, profit, individuality, individual success, individual nation success. For Indigenous peoples, overlap seems to be the only way to operate. It is the exclusive Indigenous way of operating with a life of integrity. Like, for example, there's a reason why Indigenous peoples have multiple names, multiple identities. And it kind of goes to this story right here. Like, every year the Anishinaabe and the Cree would meet here in Manitoba, and they'd have a great feast, and they'd trade tobacco, and they'd raise the water, and then here we go. And then they'd come together and they'd say, okay, where are we going to put the border this year? And the Cree would be like, well, we had more babies. And the Anishinaabe would be like, well, we had some deaths this year, so it's okay if we move the border from the tree line to the shoreline, but next year we've got to discuss where we're going to put it again, and we'll do it at the next ceremony. And the community walked away with that understanding, and then sometimes they conflicted, sometimes they even warred, but then it would eventually come together and say, okay, where are we going to put the border? That's because of a law called Minobamadzowin, which is the idea of the good life. The good life is only good life insofar that others have good life. This is really critical to understand, because education, what we teach our young people, what we teach our older people for that matter, what Indigenous education is a lifelong process about engaging with the world. It's about trying to understand how is it that we can create effective relationships with everything. It's not going, okay, my job is to be better than this thing, or I'm better than this thing, or I know what the right thing to do is over this thing. But it's to ask these fundamental questions and to never not ask these questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Who can help me? Where am I going? And that's what we do in our educational institutions, also called the lodge or the wigwam, or in the case of Meday, which is in your territory, also in my territory here, the Meday, which is our place in which we teach. It's the place in which we think, the place in which we also initiate. And these are these systems that have been in operation for millennia. And the key to understanding it is that more, or what I'll call end, is the process in which Indigenous life operates. It is through the end, not the or, but the end, that more Indigenous life is built. Like, it's amazing to me that Peter Jones can adopt Christianity and maintain being an Anishinaabe. But yet the missionaries would say to him, no, burn the drums, forget your name, cut your hair, never, not once, not ever, tell these superstitious devils worshipping stories about who you are and your creation stories, and never ever talk about those things. In fact, your job is to cease to become any of those things, and we will deem you to be successful. This is the key of understanding what our education systems are all about, which is that if we do not have a basic fundamental understanding of our roots, right, where we come from, and these are some wonderful models from the Canadian Council of Learning, and you can look these up, Métis, Inuit, First Nation. But if we just look at the First Nations as an example, like, our roots are based within our understandings of who we are, and where's that? Our creation stories. Who can help us? That's within our clans and our families. Where are we going? That's understanding our prophecies and the ways in which we can say to ourselves, who are the community that can help us to gesture and give us certain messages. And probably most importantly, why am I here? And that's what the path into education is, which is why it's so important to go out in the world and go to Japan and write a poem and, learn about Pythagorean theorem, like, those things are important because what they do is they help us understand who we fundamentally are as Anishinaabe. We're to bring those things back to say, what is the home message here? And here's the amazing thing is that if Canadians do the same thing, if they were to reach out and learn about Anishinaabe and bring that back to their home community, they're going to realize that every single thing that they're made out of is at their core Indigenous. They're going to realize something fundamental. They're going to go, oh, suddenly now I understand the words in my driver's license. I understand the land that I live on is people had to be removed off that land. I understand the economy that I benefit so greatly from, and that my profit and this house and picket fence that I have all came from Indigenous resources. And these are fundamental principles that when Canadians understand and go out and have that same principle of and, not or, then fundamental changes begin to happen, shifts begin to happen. And notice how this is what Indigenous peoples bring to the table. Missionaries brought the or. Christians often bring the or, although I would say that the problem with Christianity is ultimately the Christians, not Christianity, because if you read the Bible, Christianity is actually about and. Christianity is really about and. Christians are often saying the or stories, much I think to the behest of their own faith. I would say this is the same thing in many faiths of the world, in that the problem is not ultimately what's being taught, but who's teaching it. Now, this brings us to some really critical positions in that it explains 100% why Indigenous students are not succeeding in schools. Why? Because we expect them to become less Indigenous. That's been always the case. Going back to residential school is the worst case of that, which is our job is to absolutely eradicate any sense of indigeneity into them. But the schools still continue to promote a success or a narrative of success that reduces indigeneity, doesn't increase it. And it might just be that if we increase the sense of indigeneity, not just will Indigenous students increase their graduation rates, if that's what we decide success is, and I actually don't think that's the success rate, but non-Indigenous students will become more successful as well. Now, as we begin to look at these really important processes, we say to ourselves, why are there so many struggles with Indigenous students experiencing success? And there's a number of reasons, of course, poverty being the most pertinent. But I would say that the number one reason is that schools don't give the answers for poverty or poverty of the spirit, or schools don't give places, safe spaces, to live fully as an Indigenous person. And this is a good example of what I mean by that. I see a chat thing over here, so. Oh, yeah, sorry. Somebody is I noticed that there's, I don't think I'm seeing everybody in terms of who's on the chat, because it must be a different way that the Zoom platform is. So I can't see if anybody's making any comments or questions or anything, but we're gonna go for another 15 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to open it up to conversation. But I want to give you my formula, right? So this is my formula for Indigenous student success. Every student comes to us with potential. Like, that's obvious, right? So that remains pretty fixed. Students haven't changed over the past 250 years. I don't care what race they come from, culture, situation. Like, they all come with abilities to learn. They all come with, certain circumstances and contexts, and we may call those challenges, but generally every student I've ever known, when they begin school, they're interested in learning. They want to know. Like, just talk to any child, and it doesn't have to be a formal education, but they want to learn things. I have a toddler who my friends, I get to see once in a while with my friends when the restrictions are lifted here. It's just amazing to me how much she learns. Like, when I don't see her for 2 weeks, she's like learned like crazy. Like, so many things she's learned. People want to learn. Students want to learn, much in the way that creation also wants to learn too. That's what creation is all about. Creation is this great gift-giving place where everybody is interacting, and then things innovate and change and grow. And, Darwin called it evolution, but I think as Anishinaabe, we just call it motion. We just call it the ways in which motion operates, or we call it Gage Manido's breath, and that's the way things shift and change in the world. Things are constantly shifting and changing, or learning from one another. Now, the other thing that doesn't change is opportunity, because you're still here and I'm still here, and teachers have always been here. It doesn't matter in school, out of school, formal, informal. There's always opportunity. Meaning that Nimenwendam Omayayan, there's always like this place right now where we go, okay, what are we going to do today? We're going to offer each other gifts. We're going to offer each other teachings and stories. And we're going to offer ourselves an opportunity to understand what the world is around us. That's that asema. When we lay that asema, that's opportunity, right? Now, then this is where things begin to get highly problematic, which is that we've determined relevance. Now, to understand relevance, we have to look at success. What is success in society? Well, number one success is, do you have a job? Number two is, do you have a diploma? Number three is, do you have a place to live, and a nice place for that? Meaning that, like a house, an individual property ownership. There's capitalism. Are you a capitalist? Next is, are you healthy? Can you afford it? Do you have fresh food? Meaning, don't you live in poverty, right? My point of saying it is that success is innately tied to monetary success. And we've determined that monetary success is the only thing necessary to get success in this society. Like, for instance, there is no way in which, other than, do we ask, are you happy? But frankly, people would say money matters over happiness. So we've determined that relevancy is only relevant insofar that it gets you money, AKA a diploma, AKA capitalism and all that other stuff. That's what we've determined in schools is the only thing that matters. And here's an example, if you disagree with me, do you have any ceremonies in your school where you celebrate success that isn't about a certificate, finishing something that leads to graduation, or graduation itself? And if your answer is no, like, do you just ever have a celebration just to have a celebration, or to have just a gathering together? And if that's the case, then you're doing something different than society, because society doesn't encourage that kind of success. The only success that lives within society, the broader society around us, is that, do you have a job? Do you have money? Do you have the diploma? And if diploma is the only thing that's necessary, then only things that are relevant in related to the diploma. Well, the fact is that is exactly what the problem is in the first place. If I'm going to tell you something that's going to probably challenge something that is, and it's what I call the disconnect. Here's the disconnect. Indigenous students don't go to school for diplomas. They go to school to become better Indigenous peoples. Non-Indigenous students probably are going to school for diplomas, but they don't come out better as people, if that's the model in which we're using. Here's the way in which we bring that disconnect together. Indigenous students go to school because they want to become better Indigenous peoples. If a diploma is a part of that, then wonderful. Then two things have met there and brought together. If non-Indigenous students go to school, get a diploma, and then also become better people, meaning better understanding of themselves and their relationships with the land and the people around them, then they're going to be happy. They're going to have meaning. And by the way, they're probably going to build less pipelines. They're probably going to be more apt to challenging notions of capitalism and destroying the land. And they're probably going to be much more invested in trying to rectify injustices like murder missing Indigenous women and girls, or the fact of people sleeping on tent cities in the downtown. The fact is that if we can create better people, and also stronger Indigenous peoples, then we might have something here that can bridge the graduation issues, but it would challenge the fundamental tenets of our society around us. It's why it's so revolutionary. Like this guy right here, and we all know who this guy is. This guy cut the TRC implementation task force planning on the first weekend he was in office. And here's a good example. If Indigenous education is something that can be cut in any way, if a politician can do it, if a superintendent can do it, if a teacher can do it, if Indigenous education is something that you're like, it's in this lesson or this unit over here, and we just got to make sure that we do it. If Indigenous education is something that can be cut, you're not doing Indigenous education. Here's what I mean by that, is that Indigenous education is something that lives in the entirety of a life experience, meaning that it lives in the entirety of a school, in the hallways, far more than the classroom. Indigenous education is not a lesson plan. That's the biggest problem and the biggest ignorance that I've had to face in my career, and it's going back decades, going back to when I was a teacher as well, is that teachers think that if I just have to teach this one class on this one treaty, or memorize how many residential schools are, or learn about this experience with this novel, somehow that will create understanding. But that doesn't do anything. In fact, here's what it does. It creates more confusion, because when students go to the hallway, when students go to the office in the library, and they see that there's people out there who simply don't agree or invest themselves in power that erase us, that continue to erase us, and that they go to the hallway and they see no Indigenous faces or voices, then that one experience in that 1 hour in that one classroom feels like an anomaly. It feels weird. In fact, it feels like the teacher is a left-wing social justice nut, because the society doesn't match the classroom. Our job as educators is to think broadly about how it is that a student's experience is in the entirety of the school. And then we can work on the society, because I think if we work on the schools, the society will come along. But the entirety of the school, and we have to have willpower, and we got to get funding, and we got to get beyond misunderstandings and resources, and ultimately the fear. If we can overcome those things and realize that Indigenous education is for everyone at all times, in all places, in the office, in the hallways, and the library, far more than the classroom, because the classroom is actually the easiest place to do it. You can just plop in a lesson, but if the lesson is anomalous to the hallway, then frankly, you're not doing Indigenous education. What you're doing is you're doing a kind of a confusing endeavor that's going to create more conflict. I'm not saying don't try it. Certainly in situations where you're having too much problem in the hallway or whatever, or you have somebody in charge of your building that's going to stop you, it's still important to do the work in the classroom. But frankly, you better be ready for the extra work now, because no students are going to come to you with extra work and say, how come the principal said something different? Or how come the hallways there's no Indigenous peoples? Or hey, how come there's no Indigenous peoples in Parliament? And there isn't. There are no Indigenous peoples in Parliament that represent Indigenous peoples. There's Indigenous politicians, but they represent Canadian political parties, which, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, always lose. I can guarantee to you that if the NDP had a choice between supporting Indigenous peoples or getting reelected, they're going to choose reelection every time, and that means Canadian interests will always win. I bring all this up because this is the reality that we face, is that Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing population of the country. The places in which we're seeing that the most, we're also the youngest. The average age is between 5 and 19. And the average age of Canadian between 35 and 49. Every single Canadian will be eventually working with, living beside, or be married to an Indigenous person. Why we are exponentially growing. Yes, we are only 5% of the population of the country, but nobody's growing faster than us. We're 42.5% every 10 years. Now, we're seeing that the fastest growth in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Thunder Bay. Oh, by the way, what are the communities that this country, Maclean's magazine being the best example of that, go to, fly to, and then say it's the most racist city in the galaxy? Oh, interestingly enough, the cities with the most Indigenous peoples. That tells you that there is a gross ignorance in the country, and this gross ignorance involves understanding that what's happening in Manitoba will eventually happen in Ontario and BC. Because look at these red dots here. These red dots here are concentrations of Indigenous communities. And if you add up all those, there's in fact more Indigenous peoples in Ontario, but the population base is higher. That just means it's going to take a little bit longer. And it's going to take maybe most of our lives, maybe the most of the lives of our children. But eventually what's happening in Winnipeg, which is the largest proportional Indigenous population in the country, we're 20% of the province. That means every single person works with, lives beside, or is married to an Indigenous person. We have more Indigenous business leaders, more Indigenous professors. Who are all the winners of the art awards, the writing and the music awards? Well, they all come from Manitoba. Josh Whitehead just won Canada Reads. There's a reason why the center of Indigenous life is on the prairies right now, but we will not always be. It's going to be you. You're right up next. That also might be, by the way, something we're thinking about when Toronto magazines send reporters to our territories, say a bunch of stupid crap, and then fly back to Toronto. When in fact, what they're really talking about is a future Toronto. Because what might be happening here, which is the solutions in the business world, in the dentist world, in the private sector world, the public sector. What's happening in Winnipeg is the most innovative solutions of reconciliation. There's a reason why the TRC was started here. There's a reason why all the major leaders for the AFN often come from here. There's a reason why all these different positions and ideas and books and writers come from the prairies. I'm not just talking about Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Thunder Bay. There's a reason why all these interesting things happen here. And that might be something to learn from, not to fly to and say a bunch of stupid crap and fly back to Toronto. Like that might just be something that's worth thinking about. And I think Indigenous education is one of those things. We are doing innovative work here that's exciting and interesting. And probably the most interesting work is in the areas of reconciliation, because what we've done is we've adapted some real distinct principles, which is that we're all in this together. And we say things like schools are a social system, and it's not just about instructional materials. It's about going or formalized curriculum. It's about saying, what's the culture of the school? That means sports logos matter. That means the songs we sing, how we counsel people. What are the attitudes? Like, for instance, there's very few teachers that can get away with saying racist things on social media these days, especially here in Winnipeg, because you're not going to last very long. And it's not even a matter of call-out culture, if that's what we want to blame this week. It's a matter of if your employer finds out your division is committed to the TRC calls to action, and frankly, you just are unemployable. You can't continue to work in that environment. At the University of Manitoba, what we've done here is we've adapted to a principle that Indigenous students make up 12% of the entirety of campus. Therefore, we need to dedicate 12% of all resources, professors, buildings to Indigenous contributions. That means spirit rooms, that means buildings, that means elders and residents, that means counseling, that means we have to dedicate ourselves, not because it's special or something, because that's our mandate. Our mandate is to serve Manitobans. And those 12%, which ends up in elders and counselors and programs, Native Studies Department, which is where I work, but it's also to make sure that non-Indigenous peoples get educated appropriately at the same time, because it's not just non-Indigenous peoples that go to these buildings, but then Indigenous peoples as well, and they access elders and residents as well, and so on and so forth. One of the things that really remarkably happens is when we invest in Indigenous spaces for everyone, that Indigenous students begin to explode in success. We have the highest graduation rate of Indigenous students in North America. Let me say it again, North America. We just graduated last weekend, 550 Indigenous undergraduates. That's the highest amount in North America. That is proportionally, not just proportionally, but that is the highest amount anywhere. We have Indigenous students who, for instance, this is Nathan Legacy right here. He's my master's student. He just did a master's degree on Indigenous video games. Like, do you know how many people have that master's degree? One, and you're looking at it. This is Angelina McLeod. She's working on repossessing the scrolls from her community, which were stolen in the 1970s. Jonathan Coachman, the first Cree opera, right up here. Ashley Burchard right here, the first, or she's working on Indigenous economics, or like, what does Indigenous capitalism look like? It looks probably more like co-ops. That's what she argues, and so on and so forth. And I'm just saying that because I'm kind of a proud teacher. I'm a proud uncle to many of these young people. But here's Braden Harper. Braden Harper goes out, he works in business, right? A young Cree guy. And he starts working for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, which is a CFL team out here. If you heard of the CFL, a lot of people in Ontario may not have heard of them, but really big thing here on the prairies is the football teams, right? And so he starts working for football. He turns to the football team. He says, hey, everybody, you know what football's all about? It's about land theft. And because he learned about the treaty initiative at the University of Manitoba, which we have a treaty initiative where we teach everyone about what it means to be treaty. Everyone's a part of treaty together. Treaty is about sharing the land. And he looked at the football games. He said, well, football's about stealing the land. And it's not that football's a bad thing. It's just a story. I have season tickets too. But that when we steal the land, we trigger a lot of people. We also should talk about how when we talk about being treaty person at the start of the game, which is a territorial acknowledgement, we should talk about it, that being after the game too, that we're all in this together. Explains to you, by the way, why Indigenous sports logos are so important, because about stealing land. No wonder that's such a valuable American story. That's why they love it so much. That's a lecture for another time, or a discussion for another time. But when Braden did that, then suddenly the Winnipeg Jets wanted to do it. And why? Because they heard about this wonderful thing the Bombers did, first sports franchise in North America to make a territorial acknowledgement. And then the Jets did it, and then the Oilers did it. And I'm not telling you the territorial acknowledgements change much, but here's what they do. They teach you to see the people that you've never been seen before, that you've been encouraged not to see before, and tell you to act differently. And that's what happened when I wrote the acknowledgement for the Winnipeg Jets. And now they say it before every game. I did that back in 2016. They still saying it. And here's one other thing that they do. The Jets then began to create relationships with Indigenous communities. They fund Indigenous hockey teams. They hold this thing called Wasak Night, which is a partnership with a sports agency here in town. They do the big drum that opens the game. They indigenize the logo. They had Métis jiggers at the intermissions. They had a throat singer that started out the night and was the spotlight in the center ice. And the Oilers did something similar as well, too. Notice high proportional. And if we go back to this map over here, notice that it is the second biggest dot other than Winnipeg. Edmonton and Winnipeg, the two biggest dot. That's where you're coming. That's where you're coming to. And then the Jets did this in front of 15,000 people.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Bell MTS Place welcome to the Strong Warrior Girls Anishinaabe singers who will perform our national anthem in Ojibwe.
Now, saying "Oh Canada" in Ojibwe doesn't change the world. In fact, it changes very little. But here's what it did do. It made these young girls feel good. It taught 15,000 people that Indigenous languages matter, which is far more than any Canadian policy has ever done. And it's all because of students like Braden. When the Jets went to the Stanley Cup semifinals, the conference finals, 15 million people tuned in. And Ron MacLean opened up the broadcast that night by saying, "Welcome to Treaty 1 territory and the home of the Winnipeg Jets." Ron MacLean doesn't do that with 15 million people, which ends up eventually in "O Canada" being sung in Ojibwe at a Winnipeg Jets game, which for 15,000 people meant they were cheering Ojibwe language previously in schools where languages had been banned and children would be beaten if they were caught speaking the language. Braden did that. Braden doesn't do that unless we make space. And Braden doesn't exist unless we accept reality. And we accept reality, which is that we're all in this together. And that's the key here. The key is understanding that the most successful initiatives is understanding that we are all in this together, and we have to focus on the hallways and the libraries and the attitudes and the way we counsel and the songs we sing, far more than the classroom. Because yes, the classroom is important. In fact, that's the easiest thing you can do. The easiest thing today is you could go and download a lesson plan and start teaching, this sport or this part of the language, or you could do anything. And all of those things are incredibly important. We should be dedicating ourselves to, but we have to focus on those areas that we're actually going to form relationships, which is what Indigenous education is all about. Notice that all of these things, and I'm lucky enough that I get to go across the country, and before the pandemic, of course, but I've been able to travel to about 150,000 teachers and educators over the past 5 years. And I've been able to teach them. And when I go to their schools, I get to see the most successful initiatives. Every single one of them have an out of classroom element, a hallway element, a library element, an office element, and they connect those things. They talk about these elements. And if you want to take a picture, I encourage you to take a picture right now of these are the most successful initiatives. And in your area, I went to the Chippewas at the Thames and I worked with the people there. And one thing that we developed was the idea of how do we bring in ideas like water ceremonies into the school without building a kind of an element where we force anyone to do ceremonies, but how can we learn from those traditions, bring them in, and then talk about how we live together? Because the basic principle is that Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can get along all day, but if we got nothing to drink, then there's no point. Reconciliation is a worthless, pointless endeavor unless we have something to drink. Now, what I began to realize by studying those projects, in the last few minutes, I'm going to just show you what I mean, is that these four things are the things most lacking in schools today. Relationships, relevancy, but I'm talking about Indigenous relevancy, meaning that am I a good nephew when I finish my program? Do I know the language? Do I know about who I fundamentally am as an Anishinaabe person? Or if I'm a non-Indigenous, how do I understand my relationships with Indigenous peoples? Is there respect? I think respect is something the most lacking in the school system, of understanding this is not an optional thing. This is not like something we special or we have to, give Indigenous people something special, but this is fundamentally who Canadians are, therefore is the most important lesson and the most lacking at the same time. And then finally, responsibility. We'll realize that at the end of the day, Indigenous success involves more responsibility, like when we're in the lodge, for example. When you are successful, you are then given more responsibility. Your now job is to take care of the fire and to be an uncle. You start out as an uncle or a son, but then when you earn people's respect, then suddenly you're a drum keeper, or suddenly you're a pipe carrier. Or notice that Indigenous success is about more responsibility, not less. Okay, so as we begin to do that, then we realize something critical, which is that this is the formula for Indigenous student success, and as important, Canadian success. So here's what we do, is we turn back to our formula and we say, here is the original formula right here. The original formula is based in the notion of, just pull that up right here, that the original success was around potential plus opportunity, which is right here. There's potential plus opportunity divided by Canadian relevance, which is tied to the diploma, and we say, here is what we're talking about. We add respect throughout the whole. That's not easy, but we begin to say, let's start with respect. We know that we acknowledge, that's where the territorial acknowledgement comes in. We respect where we are. We respect that we have to change. And then what we do is we then say, okay, we're going to invest in supporting every single teacher to understand that lesson. They're going to build healthy relationships with students. And that every single teacher is like an exponent, meaning exponentially creating relationships, like multiply, multiply, multiply. Then what we do is we take the same old potential and opportunity. Remember, students all have potential. We bring opportunity. And then what we do is we still keep relevance in there, Canadian relevance, which is tied to the diploma. But then we also say to ourselves, our job is to create good nephews, good language speakers, good people that understand their relationships with territory. And how would they do that? They would understand about making drums, by creating a sense of an understanding of this ceremony, this water ceremony. But we don't have to force people to do ceremonies to do that. We can bring elements of those ceremonies into the hallway, into the libraries, and talk to people about why water is important and why people do things in this particular way. And then what we realize is that that will create more Indigenous graduates, more Canadian graduates, although Canadian graduates, frankly, are already doing pretty good, because what we'll realize is that then everyone has more responsibilities. And that responsibilities is to be a treaty person, or to be a person living together, or to be a good person whose job and understanding that the world full of poverty, competition, and capitalism might not be the world that we want. We might create a world with less conflict, more competency, more employability. We might create a world that looks, about where people relate with one another and talk about reconciliation. Because reconciliation is a bunch of nonsense unless it's about communication. And it's about saying, this is what it looks like altogether. And just like Kakwakanami did way back in the 18th century, when he looked out and he saw that schools are about bringing people together, just as he saw that too, we too can see that Indigenous peoples have always been doing that for everyone, and that Indigenous peoples, by offering our teachings from what we see in the land to bring to the newcomers, in that's how we can create a future together. That all of us, there's a reason why Canada is called the village, it's not called pipeline. The Canada is called the place in which the power and the riches that live in this place are with each other. The beauty of this place is that nobody's going anywhere, and that we're all in this together. That's what I hope to bring to success. And I hope that you appreciated all of the things that I had to share around success. I hope that you enjoyed thinking a little bit more about how Indigenous success can be the success of everyone. And then I hope also that you understood, or that you appreciated, that Indigenous education is not something that lives in a classroom or a lesson plan. It's something that lives far more than that in the hallway, in the office, in the library. So I say huge miigwech and thank you for bringing me out there. And I'm happy to, I know that we're short on time. So if you wanted me to stick around, happy to do so. I have a meeting in about 20 minutes with a student, but I'm happy to push that ahead as well. So miigwech to everybody, and thank you very much for your time.
Miigwech, Niigaan. Miigwech, Anishinaabe, and miigwech, Wendam. So it was a great conversation, a great teachings, just a great time listening to you, because you come with such a wealth of information, and I think there's a lot of you touched on a lot of points that we struggle with when it comes to Indigenous education. As an Indigenous lead for our school board here, I tend to see a few different things here and there. One thing to address is the problem with ministry, the problem that we have this trust fund dollars that sitting out of Ottawa that we have from resource extraction, but
well, there's a question of whether that's really a fund or not. I think some people like to talk about that fund, and I think certainly you could add it all up if you wanted to, but I don't think there's a room full of money anywhere. I think that's a bit of an illusion, and people are being naive when they think that.
Well, I had Canada at the table one time, and I was questioning about that. How much do we have? And we said we went from 9 to 2. I didn't question whether it was true or not. I just said, okay. I said, well, is that me? Is that my music?
It's not me.
Sorry, it must have came on my part. Oh, well, I think that's your presentation.
Oh, is it?
We're not hearing it, Dallas. You're good to go. You can continue the thought.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
It must be on my end. I'm not sure. You guys can't hear that?
Nope.
Okay. Just
Maybe it's the spirits talking to you.
Okay. So anyways, oh, I found it. Okay. Apologize for that. Yeah, the spirits. Okay. So I when I was talking to Canada on the other line, and he said that we'll never be able to get those funds based on with Canada and their deficit, that they're taking money out of our trust, and so it was a question of whether or not we should be preparing for sovereignty, and I think you and I already know that that we're probably light years away from something like that, and getting away from the Indian Act. But so when it comes to ministry,
probably less so with C-15. I mean,
Yeah.
people want to bash C-15, but C-15 is not the ending; it's the beginning, and it's like the drop in the bucket. We have to remember that it's still a bucket. C-15 is just a drop in that bucket. People want the whole bucket, but it's like, have you ever dealt with an abusive person, right? So that they can't quit their violent and abusive and self-destructive behavior like that.
Right.
Like most people, when you need time, you need rehab, you need care, concern, generosity. And the problem, of course, is we've been kind and generous for 500 years. And the bottom line of it is that Canada is not going to change overnight. They're not going to give sovereign. Well, first of all, you can't give sovereignty, but you can remove the power and control in order for sovereignty to take place, right? Or for people to evoke a full sense of self-determination. The self-determination right now is a sham. It's a lie. It's a made-up concept that's just a bunch of flowery words that means nothing, because self-determination is like municipality creation, which is what First Nations generally are, which are just, we can control like the curtains of the house, but we don't own the house. Like we can change the curtains, but we, maybe put in some carpet, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Those are metaphors, by the way.
When it comes to dollars and in ministry dollars, I don't think we're getting enough to help bring in a lot of Indigenous educators to help our schools, so not seeing enough of the brown face in the school for our Indigenous students. But also, I do agree with what you're talking about with the content that should be splashed throughout the school, not just in the front foyer, once a month, right? It should be, splashed throughout the whole school so that our Indigenous population can feel proud to be in our schools all the time. And then another thing is the language teachers. We're not hiring, fluent speakers. As you know, our language is on a decline, right? So we hire teachers that can teach word lists. So it's not good enough, but we're getting there. And I think having people like you to advocate, on behalf of Indigenous educators and kind of guide that along, and with presentations like this, I think we're making some headway. So Chimigwech, there's some questions in the chat. I guess it's
I can't see any of them, so
Yep. So we have one person saying, you're such a great speaker and very knowledgeable. John Ward, I am the president of the local Kiwanis Club. We're trying to educate our members on Indigenous history and culture. How best should we proceed?
So, miigwech for that, John. Here, I work a lot with Rotary International. In fact, if you look right up there, Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I work a lot with Rotary, and so I'm very involved with the community organization. I really believe in Rotary because of the service element, and I know that the Kiwanis are very similar. So I just want to say that miigwech for your work, and I know that it's difficult. I know also the biggest challenge Rotary has is that they have no Indigenous presence. They have no Indigenous members, very few of them anyways, but yet they have all business people within that organization that have Indigenous clients, no Indigenous peoples. Many are married to Indigenous peoples. And so what that means is it gives you an opportunity. It gives you an opportunity to build within in the organization to try to bring knowledge keepers somewhere in to be able to support you in what your initiative should be locally, because it should be Indigenous peoples leading you in your initiatives projects. Like the last thing you want to do is say, okay, I'm going to build this project over here. Let's say it's a clean water program or something for this community over here, and we're going to do it without the community's involvement. Like that's just absolutely silly. So what you would do is you would say to the community instead, what is it that you need? What would be the most effective way that we can assist you? And that most importantly, we want to learn at the same time. So we want you to help us to understand what it is that's so important for your community. And then therefore we can collaborate and come together. We have access to resources and funds and space and time because we're service people. And we know that you need service. So instead of saying, we're going to bring the service to you, we're going to say, what can we do together? And that's probably the best way that you can proceed. Now, in terms of education, there's 100 different ways and people you can bring in. I do that work a lot, but I have no doubt there are also 100 people who are being spoken to this week in this sessions that are probably more local to your area that can help you in terms of education. Education, though, is like a drop in the bucket. Keep remembering that it's a bucket, right? And therefore, to get to a point in which reconciliation can begin, because we are not at the point of its beginning. We're not even at the stage in which the conversation has begun. We're just thinking about it now. We're just introducing the concept to one another. It's like the territorial acknowledgement is just a step in a journey. It's a drop in the bucket. It's not the bucket. So when we start that process, then you realize, okay, there's a lot of work we have to do. The first step is education. And then if our goal is to get to service projects that we're working with. And then eventually what you hope is that communities will adopt your organization, start calling you brother and sister and cousin. And that's the goal. Remember, more responsibility, not less.
Great. Thanks for that, Niigaan. We got, and then one more, we got a compliment. You should get into politics and help our people.
Yeah, I saw that one. That's
Future Grand
the worst idea ever. And I don't want to get into that. Meaning that, like, okay, I've been asked to run for politics for Canadian political parties 3 times now. And 2 times federally, 1 time provincially. And I can tell you that I'll never do it. And here's why. I enjoy this far too much. I know that this is 100% more impactful than any politician could ever be involved. And the only people who ever make impressions in political parties are the leaders. Ministers are all just people who follow the leader. So like, what's the point there? And then probably most of all is that, I don't mean to be a pessimist, is that remember what I said about Indigenous people working for political parties. I don't care how good of a person they are. And I've got friends who work in political parties. When you're in political parties, Canadian political parties, Indigenous peoples will always lose. Occasionally we'll come out with a small victory here and there, but we'll always lose because Canadians the problem is education of Canadians. We have to work at that. That's where I think the true message of reconciliation is that I'll do more work out here helping to educate young non-Indigenous peoples, Canadian students, that a politician will ever do for Indigenous communities. And what I mean is that it's really a battle that has to be in the spirits and the minds and the hearts of Canadians and Indigenous peoples, bringing people together. That's where reconciliation will live.
Miigwech, for those answers. And Niigaan, I really appreciate all the time that you've shared with us. And I understand that we're able to utilize you again in the future when it comes to our secondary and elementary classrooms. So we'll keep a lookout for that. And Chimigwech Minwa.
Well, Yigawaman Minawa, thanks so much for your time. And I truly meant it, Dallas, when I spoke to you this morning, just to be clear that I really, I originally the plan was for me to spend some time with some classrooms as a part of this visit. And I don't want to renege on that. So I want to get on that as soon as I can. and is probably my overbooked. I've been overbooked for months, and I'm finally relaxing this in May. Things have lightened up a bit. So, please let me know, and I'd be happy to step into any classrooms in your district. I'm sure there's maybe teachers in this who could use a guest speaker for an hour or something like that. Would be happy to do it. You just tell me what you need. And remember that I am a former classroom teacher, and I know how hard it is to be a teacher. And so I'm happy to help out with whatever you need in terms of your classroom. So miigwech, everybody.
Chimigwech Hogima. And we'll see you again, Bamompi. And Chimigwech, and I hope everybody enjoyed the presentation.
Take care. Miigwech. Yawaman.
Yeah, come on.